Did you know Shamans had 4 shocks in their history as a class? And one of them was even considered the most overpowered spell in vanilla WoW. First, let's start off with Earthshock. In Earthshock's first form, it had a short 20-yard range, a shared 6-second cooldown with the other 2 shocks, and its effect was simply to do upfront damage and interrupt spellcasting for 2 seconds. Yep, that's right, a normal DPS ability had a baked-in interrupt, in a time where only a handful of classes even had an interrupt, let alone one on a short 6-second cooldown, and let alone one that did good damage. Earthshock was suitably OP against casters. Now, this may surprise you to hear, considering just how good an OP Earthshock sounds in its first form, but it actually wasn't the most overpowered shock Shamans had. Frostshock was. It was also the second most damage of the 3 shocks per cast. Flameshock did a little more damage if you counted its full dot into the equation, but for a pure, upfront, instant damage point of view, Earthshock was the best. Earthshock was also changed very early on to cause extra aggro, in case you wanted to pull extra aggro for some reason. Both Enhanced Shamans and Elemental Shamans were pretty mana starved on a whole. If they ever needed to use Earthshock as only an interrupt, it was not a foreign concept for them to just use one of its lower ranks to conserve on mana. Now let's talk about Frostshock in its first form. In its very first form, Frostshock had a 20-yard range, 6-second cooldown, and lasted 8 seconds, and did a little bit of upfront damage. Oh, did I say a little bit? I'm sorry, I meant a lot of damage. Shamans could kite you with just using Frostshock off cooldown every 6 seconds, because it did both good damage and slowed. It really was all you needed to win against other classes in PvP. No other class had a range slow with a duration longer than its cooldown, let alone one with good damage. Plus, mobility wasn't really a thing in vanilla, so being kited was a big deal. Warriors could only charge out of combat, rogues had sprint on like a 5-minute cooldown, and hunters didn't get the jump back portion and disengage until Wrath of the Lich King. Until then, all it did was reduce threat. So you could just run around in circles kiting a rogue or warrior for days, or just get in the face of a hunter and stay inside his melee range or try messing with him in his dead zone of 5 to 8 yards, all while just spamming Frostshock. Lots of people complained about how Frostshock was a one-button I win attack, because it kinda was. You could legitimately beat someone with just Frostshock, but it wasn't really that bad. In patch 1.4, DRs were added for slows, making Frostshock no longer a one-win button. With the DRs, you could only use Frostshock 3 times before the target became immune to the slow. Until patch 1.6, targets were also immune to the damage of Frostshock once it reached full DRs. So for the rest of vanilla, Frostshock wasn't an overpowered spell, but still pretty good, and the DR on slows wasn't removed until the Burning Crusade. Flameshock was the dot shock available to Shamans. Shamans could choose to cast one of 3 shocks at a time, since they all shared the same cooldown. Flameshock was probably the most used, seeing as it did the most damage per cast, during most expansions anyway, compared to the other 2 shocks if you included its full dot duration in addition to its upfront damage. Plus, it interacted with other Shaman abilities in a vital way, in which you had no choice but to use it first, and then maybe you could choose one of the other 2 shocks later. In Flameshock's first form, it was a 12-second dot that did a little bit of upfront damage, had a short 20-yard range just like the other 2 shocks, and shared a 6-second cooldown. Of the 3 shocks, Flameshock was the most mana efficient, and did the most total damage if you counted the full dot per cast. Which is not half bad considering how overpowered the other 2 shocks were at this time in comparison, which means it still very much saw use. In the Burning Crusade, Earthshock was changed to no longer generate extra threat, and instead, Frostshock was the extra threat generator shock, allowing more liberal use of Earthshock for damage in the times when threat was still a thing DPS had to worry about. Frostshock was changed in BC to give extra threat on use, in case Shamans wanted to pull threat on a mob for some reason. It makes sense to tie an extra threat generator to a slow, I guess, so Frostshock wasn't the worst ability in the world to get this treatment. Also, like I said a little earlier, this is also when the DRs on Frostshock's slow was removed. Flameshock only saw minor changes until Wrath of the Lich King, seeing as it was already pretty balanced, it didn't need very many changes. In Wrath, a new ability was added to Shamans called Lava Burst. which when used on a target would consume Flame Shock to cause it to crit, with a glyph available to not consume the dot on use. Later on, Blizzard just changed Lava Burst to not consume Flame Shock on use, because it just pissed everyone off having to use a glyph to not purge their own dot from using a rotational ability, and instead changed the glyph to allow Flame Shock to crit. Because at this time in WoW's history, by default, dots did not crit or scale with haste. You needed special set bonuses, talents, or glyphs to let them do that, and only a handful of dots could even have the ability to be altered in this way. With patch 3.3.3, Flame Shock was given the ability to crit and be affected by haste baseline, one of the very first dots in the game to get this treatment before Blizzard changed most dots to work this way in Cataclysm. And the Flame Shock glyph was changed for a third time, this time to increase the crit damage of Flame Shock by 60%. It was also in Wrath of the Lich King that Flame Shock saw its duration increased from 12 to 18 seconds. Not a terribly significant change, but this did mean you didn't have to cast Flame Shock as often, which helped considering it did share a cooldown with two other shocks. I should also mention that Wrath introduced Dispel protection to Flame Shock in the form of a 30% haste buff, if you took the talent anyway. In Wrath of the Lich King, a new shock was introduced that would also have the interrupt effect, called Wind Shock. Wind Shock shared a 6-second cooldown with the other 3 shocks, and was meant as a replacement to Shamans using rank 1 Earth Shock as an interrupt. Wind Shock did no damage, but was not on the global cooldown, and a lowered threat. It had the same 20-yard range like all the other shocks, and interrupted for 2 seconds like Earth Shock. Then in patch 3.2, Wind Shock was renamed to Wind Shear, and was no longer counted as a shock, and instead, it had its very own, non-shared 6-second cooldown. It still did exactly the same thing as it did before though. The only major change was its name, and having its own cooldown. So for a very short time in the Wrath of the Lich King, Shamans had 4 shocks instead of the historical 3. Earth Shock was also changed at this time. Instead of having an interrupt effect, they changed it to apply a melee attack speed slow. Since they already had Wind Shear to interrupt off the global cooldown, there wasn't really a reason for Earth Shock to also have an interrupt. Unless Blizzard wanted to be crazy and give Shamans 2 interrupts on 2 very short cooldowns. 6 seconds was the second shortest cooldown for an interrupt in the game, the first being Rogues with Fan of Knives. Rogues could take a talent at around the same time all these changes went through, which gave Fan of Knives a baked-in interrupt, and Fan of Knives had no cooldown. So as long as Rogues had the energy to use Fan of Knives, they could interrupt. But Fan of Knives had a pretty short range, so Wind Shear and Earth Shock still held the record for shortest cooldown on a ranged interrupt. In Wrath, Frost Shock no longer did tons of damage. It had talents that would also give Frost Shock a root if used on targets 15 yards away. But Frost Shock still had its 20-yard range by default, so it was kinda hard to pull off. Frost Shock also had a glyph to increase its slow duration by 2 seconds, turning it into a 10-second slow. So if you took every single talent and glyph for Frost Shock, you could have it on a 3-second cooldown, slow for 10 seconds, and root at long range. And it was only kind of meh at this time. But in Wrath of the Lich King, nearly everyone had mobility or gap closers now, and PvP was probably the most bursty it's ever been in the history of the game. So slowly killing someone by kiting them around with just Frost Shock wasn't really a thing anymore. In Cataclysm, Flame Shock had its low range of 20 yards increased to 25 yards by default. Yay! 25 yards is actually still pretty damn short, especially for a dot. A dot part of your normal rotation, I might add. There have always been talents, though, to increase its range, so it wasn't that bad. It was also in Cataclysm that Enhanced Shamans were turned into AoE gods for like the first time ever. Enhanced Shamans could now spread Flame Shock to 4 new targets every time they hit with their Lava Lash. So when this dot, which was tuned around being pretty much a single target only dot, was now spread to 4 new targets every time you used one of your normal rotational abilities, well, it did a lot of AoE damage. Tons of AoE damage, in fact, because Enhanced Shamans also had another ability called Fire Nova, which would cause all targets with Flame Shock on them to explode for AoE damage. This meant that after one spread, your Fire Nova would activate on 5 targets, with all 5 targets taking damage from the other 5 Fire Novas as well, giving Enhanced Shamans top tier AoE damage. Not the best though. Cataclysm was also the time when Combustion Spread Fire Mages were first put into the game, and that was the best AoE damage in the history of the game. So nothing could really compare to that, but it was still pretty good regardless. In Cataclysm, Earthshock had its melee slow debuff increased, and was a rotational ability for Elemental Shamans to spend their stacks of Lightning Shield. Ele Shamans had a talent to increase the number of Lightning Shield stacks on themselves by using normal abilities, and they could cast Earthshock to consume all the extra charges on their shield past 1 to do the damage instantly. The extra damage was separate to Earthshock's damage, so Earthshock acted more of a detonator for the talent, rather than the talent buffing Earthshock's damage. In Cataclysm, when Blizzard finally made the push to make nearly every range attack of a 40-yard range by default, Frostshock kept its short 20-yard range. It was increased to 25 yards a little later on though, which was still pretty short. In Mist, Flameshock had its duration increased 2 times. The first from 18 to 24 seconds, turning it into a pretty long dot, and then again later on from 24 seconds to 30, making it the second longest dot in the game, I think. To my knowledge, I can't really think of any other dot that was longer than 30 seconds baseline. Besides Curse of Doom that Warlocks have, which was a minute long. But the whole point of Curse of Doom is that it's a long dot, so it's historically worked different than other dots. Some expansions it would only tick 1 time after 60 seconds, and in others it would tick once every 15 seconds. But Flameshock was probably the longest conventional dot, meaning ticking every 3 seconds like most other dots do. For Earthshock and Mist, it still worked like it did in Cataclysm, only it now applied a melee damage reduction debuff rather than a melee attack speed slow. In Warlords, Earthshock was changed to be an elemental only spell, with Enhance and Resto Shamans encouraged to just use Frostshock if they wanted quick instant cast damage, since the debuff from Earthshock was also removed. Also in Warlords, Earthshock was used pretty much for the exact same purpose it was used in Cataclysm and Mist, as a way to spend your Lightning Shield stacks. Except now it no longer applied a debuff, and still had the same short 25-yard range and 6-second shared cooldown. In Warlords of Draenor, Enhanced Shamans were given a perk to spread Flameshock to 6 targets instead of 4 when AoEing. For Frostshock in Warlords, its only change was to stop generating extra threat. In Legion, Frostshock underwent a few changes. Its cooldown was removed, so for the first time it no longer had its shared 6-second cooldown with the other shocks. Its range was also finally increased to 40 yards, and now only available to Elemental Shamans. Shamans can use Maelstrom to increase its duration and damage. Also, if you take the talent Ice Fury, you can become a pseudo-vanilla Shaman again for a short time. This spell will buff your next 4 Frost Shocks by 400% after using it, allowing you to spam hard-hitting Frost Shocks, each one hitting for nearly 3 times the damage of a single lightning bolt, like the days of old. Then in Legion, like most Shaman spells, Flameshock underwent a few changes. Flameshock is now only usable by Resto and Elemental Shamans. For both specs, they were given a 40-yard range by default. Finally, I might add. For Elemental, the dot has no cooldown, and has a baseline duration of 15 seconds, but can be increased to up to 30 seconds depending on how much Maelstrom you spend when you cast it. And for Resto Shamans, it still has its 6-second cooldown, and only lasts 21 seconds by default instead of 30. And does basically what it's always done, puts up a little upfront damage and applies the dot. Also, Lava Lash no longer spreads Flameshock, seeing as Flameshock was removed from enhancement. Then in Legion, Earthshock saw major changes. Its cooldown was removed, its base range increased to 40 yards, and was no longer just the detonator to another ability, and instead is now used for its own damage. Earthshock is the main way Elemental Shamans want to spend their Maelstrom resource. Earthshock does damage based on how much Maelstrom you have, and will just use all of it. So using it at 100 Maelstrom will result in the most damage, but it's typically used at around 92 Maelstrom to avoid Maelstrom capping. Earthshock has come a long way from its early days as an OP interrupt to just kinda being used to activate another ability, and then finally to being a main damage dealer ability. Now, I only mentioned wind shear very briefly while talking about it when it was still called wind shock. So to end off the video, I'll go through the rest of the history of wind shear. Like I mentioned earlier, wind shear was first introduced into the game as Shaman's 4th shock, wind shock, then later changed to wind shear and getting its own non-shared cooldown. In Cataclysm, its range was increased to 25 yards, lockout duration increased to 3 seconds, and its cooldown increased to 15 seconds, but could be lowered to 5 seconds with talents. This 5-second ranged interrupt made Shamans the best interrupt in class in Cataclysm, in an expansion with tons of boss fights requiring lots of interrupts. You could just bring one appropriate spec Shaman with the talent to interrupt everything, or assign interrupt priorities to everyone else in raid. Many fights were made easier by just having the 5-second range interrupt, especially in 10-man raids where you had less people. In Mists of Pandaria, its lockout duration was lowered back to 2 seconds, and its base cooldown was lowered from 15 to 12 seconds. In Warlords of Draenor, its range was increased to 30 yards from 25, a throwback to when it was still a shock, since all shocks had historically short ranges. But most other range interrupts had lower than normal ranges as well, so bringing it up to 30 yards by default just brought it more in line with the other range interrupts. It was also changed to no longer reduce threat, and its lockout duration was changed back to 3 seconds again, while keeping its 12-second cooldown. And this is how wind shear still works to this day.